I thought I'd launch a series of more casual conversations to describe how I came to many of these conclusions that are, you may notice, very counter to what prevailing wisdom suggests. For instance, I think you've gathered by now that cholesterol testing, reducing cholesterol, is a fool's errand. It's completely useless. It has almost no benefit whatsoever. Yet it has made tons of money for the pharmaceutical industry, that has fueled a marketing machine that has managed to brainwash most of my colleagues. The real tragedy here is not that the pharmaceutical industry has made a lot of money. That is a tragedy. But the real tragedy is that this focus on something that has little to do with real heart disease risk management caused everyone's attention to be distracted from the real causes. And that's why over 80 million Americans take a statin cholesterol drug that has not resulted in meaningful reductions in cardiovascular death or other events. That's why your hospital may have added a $80 or $100 million cardiovascular health wing to great fanfare, because heart disease, specifically coronary disease. By the way, when I say heart disease, I usually mean coronary disease. There are many other forms of heart disease. There are cardiomyopathies, rhythm disorders, valvular disorders, etc. But for our purposes today, let's agree that heart disease in this context means coronary disease, heart attack, sudden cardiac death, need for stent implantation, bypass surgery. So you may have noticed that this remains, heart disease, coronary disease, remains the number one moneymaker for your healthcare system. And so there's a lot of money put into the technology to make sure that they can deliver procedures, because there's almost no real effort made to prevent heart disease. Well, one of the ideas that emerged from all this were the ideas that led to my Wheat Belly series of books. How'd that happen? Well, I was doing procedures. I was doing stent implantation, atherectomies, balloon angioplasty, all the things we do to open people's arteries because they were having angina or because they had a heart attack and their arteries had closed, one of their arteries had closed. So you open arteries. So it was the early and mid 1990s, and this technology was rapidly evolving. That's what I did, day and night, often 7 days a week, opening people's arteries. Well, my mom then developed chest pain, went to the ER. She's living in New Jersey at the time. I had just moved from Cleveland to Milwaukee at the time. And my mom had to go to the hospital, and she got 2 vessels that underwent coronary angioplasty. And then she went home. And then 4 months later, after her successful coronary angioplasty in New Jersey, she was found dead, sudden cardiac death. Well, here, I'm doing these kinds of procedures, and my mom dies of the disease after the sort of procedures I was doing. So it was a very vivid illustration to me that what I was doing and what the world was doing was inadequate. That is, if you try to deal with a disease in a heart catheterization laboratory in a hospital, people often die at home, or they die en route to the hospital, or have other tragic events. And so it became clear that what I was doing, and had spent 17 years in education and advanced training, 17 years, was inadequate, and many instances was wrong. And so how do you deal with that, right? Well, I continued to practice that's what's called interventional cardiology, opening people's arteries. But I started asking different questions, like how could I have told my mom 2 years, 5 years, 10 years ahead of time that she was at risk for these dangerous things, and what could she have done about it? I'm not sure she would have done it because she's a little bit a strong-minded kind of person. But nonetheless, at least let's pose that question. Well, in conventional circles, they would say use the cholesterol. Now, think about how absurd that is. If I said your total cholesterol is 240 milligrams per deciliter and your LDL bad cholesterol is 160 milligrams, are you going to die of a heart attack tomorrow, next Tuesday, next year, 10 years from now? Never. You cannot make those kinds of judgments or predictions from cholesterol values. They're much too crude. The crude technology that led to those collections of numbers in a cholesterol panel should have been abandoned decades ago. So I looked for better tools, and they were becoming available around that time, early 90s, 1990s, mid-1990s. One of the tools was lipoprotein analysis. That is, analyzing the particles in the bloodstream that actually do cause heart disease. The original efforts to use cholesterol were actually an indirect method of trying to quantify lipoproteins. Your body is made largely of fat or lipids. If you don't have fat or lipids in your body, and you're mostly protein and aqueous compounds, you would jump in a pool or a bathtub and you would dissolve. Of course, that doesn't happen because we are largely lipid-based creatures. But the problem is lipids or fats cannot be conducted through the bloodstream as lipids or fats, because if they did, they would coalesce, just like they do in salad dressing. You know, when you make salad dressing, you have oil that floats to the top and the vinegar and water floats to the bottom. So oils tend to coalesce. If oils were allowed to coalesce, that is, the plentiful oils and lipids in your bloodstream and in your body, if they were allowed to coalesce, you would fall apart, right? Your body would fall, you would die rapidly because they would infarct or plug up the vessels of your body. So in order for fats and lipids to be transacted through your bloodstream, they need to be coupled to proteins. And that is where lipoproteins come from, fat-carrying proteins. Well, there were ways, even back 25, 35 years ago, there was a very solid collection of technologies to study, assess those lipoproteins. It could have been putting the clear part of your blood, the plasma, into a gel and then passing a current through it and seeing how different particles migrate based on charge. That's called gel electrophoresis. There was also ultracentrifugation. All that meant was taking your plasma once again and spinning it at high speed in a centrifuge, and you'll see the different layers of lipoproteins layer out. You can study each layer, see what they're made of, and how many particles are in there. Or you could put them into a nuclear magnetic resonance, or MRI, NMR or MRI machine that uses magnetic fields to analyze the number and quality of the particles in the bloodstream, the lipoproteins. So there are three general methods, even 30 years ago. The one that's persisted to today and used most widely is the NMR, the nuclear magnetic resonance. The other methods are perfectly fine, but they never really caught on commercially. They have this problem where the voice of Big Pharma is so overpowering and its influence on my colleagues so strong that these new technologies really never caught on. It took more sophistication to understand what they meant. It was a little bit more expensive, not that much more. And it wasn't part of the mainstream conversation that said over and over and over again, cholesterol is the culprit, saturated fat is the culprit. And you're going to see, this all falls apart in light of better science. And this science has marched forward over 30 years to the credit of people like Dr. Ronald Krauss at University of California, Berkeley, a group at Johns Hopkins, a lot of work done in Toronto, University of Toronto, other work done at University of Texas. In other words, we're not talking about obscure, silly, speculative, functional medicine or naturopathic type. We're talking about stuff worked out in hard science over the last 30 plus years. For instance, we know with good evidence, very good evidence, 55 clinical trials, that it's not cholesterol, it's not LDL cholesterol that is the driver of coronary atherosclerosis, the stuff that causes heart attacks, other events like sudden cardiac death or the need for procedures. We know that it's particles, lipoprotein particles, like the very low density lipoproteins, VLDL, and small LDL particles. Another technology that came out around the early 1990s was quantifying coronary atherosclerosis using a CT heart scan, or actually back then an electron beam tomography device, now replaced by CT heart scans. But both technologies yielded something called a calcium score, coronary calcium score. The reason for that, looking at calcium, was my friend Dr. John Rumberger, who was working at the Mayo Clinic at the time, showed in an autopsy series of people who had died from a whole variety of different causes, car accidents, tumble down the stairs, all kinds of reasons, that regardless of age, sex, or cause of death, calcium comprises 20% of total atherosclerotic plaque volume in the coronary arteries. So in other words, if you had 2 cubic millimeters of calcium, you had 10 cubic millimeters of total coronary atherosclerotic plaque. So it became clear that you use calcium as an index of total coronary atherosclerotic plaque. And then Dr. Arthur Agatston, you may recognize that name. He got pretty well known for his South Beach diet. He developed a scoring method that used plaque area and density to generate what is now called the Agatston score. Normal is 0, and the more plaque you have, area and density, the higher your score. So a score, say, of 400 would be very common and suggests moderate to advanced coronary disease. And that puts you at risk for plaque rupture that causes heart attack and sudden death, or progressive occlusion of the artery that leads to angina, and then the need for things like stents or bypass surgery. So even today, the Agatston score is the most common measure used to quantify coronary calcium. Well, now we're going back once again, over 30 years. We helped show that if you did nothing and your score is, let's just say 400, how fast will it increase? 25% per year. Now, we're still going back about 35 years. The science became clear. We contributed a whole bunch of participants to these data. What happens if you have a score of, say, 400 and you do nothing? Well, not wise, of course, but the score will increase 25% per year. So a year later, 400 becomes 500, another year later, 625, and onwards. And as you get to these very high numbers, particularly around 1,000, the likelihood you're going to die, have a heart attack, or have some other catastrophic event is very high. So that score of 400, it's like a crystal ball. It tells you that within 6-7 years or so, something bad is going to happen to you. So if you know that, you can take action. Well, back then, 30 plus years ago, the only action we had was statin cholesterol drugs, baby aspirin, reducing saturated fat, total fat in your diet, an exercise program. So we contributed patients to these data. What happens when you do that? What my colleagues to this day continue to call optimal medical therapy. How fast does the calcium score increase? 25% per year. It has virtually no effect. It's nonsense. It's garbage. So what do I do, though? I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I opened up Milwaukee Heart Scan because we wanted to screen people. These are people like you and me, going to work, going to school, riding our bikes, going for walks, not having chest pain. So this is not people in the emergency room with chest pain, people in heart failure. I'm talking about people just going about their business but have some level of unrecognized coronary atherosclerosis. When you look for it, you find it everywhere. You find people who feel just fine have lots of coronary atherosclerosis. What do you do about it? If we did nothing, it leads to trouble. We know that taking a statin drug and baby aspirin and low-fat diet, etc., has virtually no effect. What do you do? Well, it took me a number of years of trial and error, reasoning, science, and to finally come upon the formula that puts a stop to the progression of coronary calcium scores. But one of the major, and back now to this idea that we started with, that is where the wheat belly ideas come from. What became clear when you do lipoprotein analysis, not lipid or cholesterol testing, but lipoprotein analysis, the two patterns that emerge are the ones I mentioned: excess VLDL and small LDL. Those two things cause heart disease. Well, what factors cause VLDL and small LDL? Wheat, grains, and sugars. That is the amylopectin A, carbohydrate of wheat. And this science is very solid. It's not my speculation. This has been shown repeatedly in clinical trials, in animal work, in human work, that it's wheat, grains, and sugars. Sugars, right? Sucrose, fructose, glucose. But also the amylopectin A, unique to wheat and grains, is a flagrant trigger for the formation of small LDL. So rather than cut saturated fat, total fat, I asked people to let's cut out the wheat, grains, and sugars. And they did. And small LDL particles would drop to the floor. A common measure, for instance, on an NMR, lipoprotein analysis, would be, let's say somebody starts at 2,000 nanomoles per liter, particle count per volume. They go wheat, grain, and sugar-free, it drops to 0 or some other very low number. In other words, unlike a statin cholesterol type effect where you have like a 10, 20, 30% improvement, you have eradication more often than not. It also became clear that the process in your liver that creates that VLDL and small LDL particles was amplified by insulin resistance and inflammation, two processes that underlie not just coronary disease, but other conditions also, like type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's dementia, multiple conditions. So to address that, the diet's a start, but we added nutrients largely lacking in modern life. Magnesium, because you drink filtered water, and it's absent from most of your produce, your vegetables. Iodine, especially if you live inland and don't get enough seafood or seaweed. Omega-3 fatty acids, because people have abandoned consumption of brain rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and we can't eat all the fish and shellfish we want because industrialization has contaminated the oceans with mercury and cadmium. And then we also get vitamin D because we live indoor lives, wear clothes, and gradually as we age lose the capacity to activate vitamin D in the skin. So those four things put together also synergize to minimize insulin resistance and inflammation, and thereby contribute to giving you better control over the liver's production of VLDL and small LDL. And then most recently, I've added efforts to correct a disrupted gastrointestinal microbiome, which is a big deal now. It's affecting at least half the US population. And the reason why that's important, when you've disrupted the gastrointestinal microbiome, because you took antibiotics, because you had glyphosate residues in your food, because you're exposed to preservatives and emulsifying agents and other factors in processed foods, you kill off numerous beneficial species in the colon, which then allows fecal microbial species like E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter to overproliferate and then, even more remarkably, ascend into the small intestine. The small intestine is very permeable because that's where we absorb nutrients, but when fecal microbes come to occupy the small intestine, they live and die rapidly, shed their toxic components that then gain entry through the very permeable small intestine into the bloodstream, and that's called endotoxemia. And once again, endotoxemia, a major driver of insulin resistance, inflammation, thereby production of VLDL, small LDL, and also a trigger for plaque rupture. That is the sudden eruption of the fatty elements in your arteries that causes a blood clot to form. So the whole concept of wheat belly, elimination of wheat, grains, and sugars, and then those nutrients to minimize insulin resistance and some of the other strategies, all came from years of trying to get better control over the rise in coronary calcium scores. And you know what? Now you understand, if you put these things to work, you can track the success or failure of your program by getting a coronary calcium score, engaging in the program, right? No wheat, grains, or sugars, minimizing VLDL and thereby small LDL, address those common nutrients, address your disrupted gastrointestinal microbiome. That's a whole conversation of its own. I refer you to my other videos as well as my thousands of blog posts, WilliamDavisMD.com. Or if you need guidance, I invite you to join my community where we discuss these things most weeks for a couple hours. innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. But know that you have enormous power. Sadly, the world, my colleagues, are too trapped in this quicksand of low-fat statin cholesterol drugs that do not work. Yet the science has advanced sufficient for you to craft a product, and you can track it and prove it, right? If your heart scan score, your coronary calcium score is 400, and you find out you have oodles of small LDL particles, you have insulin resistance, vitamin D deficiency, lack of magnesium, lack of omega-3 fatty acids, and you address your colonic dysbiosis or your small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and the next score you obtain is 223, you've proven to yourself you have enormous control. And by the way, when you try to do this, you don't have to get your calcium score back to zero. It doesn't happen too often. The only time I see coronary calcium score revert back to zero is if you start with a very low number, like in the double digits, like 72 or 38. People who are higher score 400, 900, 1,000, 2,000. You don't have to get to zero, and you probably can't anyway. But if you stop the progression of the score, the otherwise relentless 25% per year increase, or even get a reduction score, for all practical purposes, your risk approaches zero. That is, you're unlikely to experience plaque rupture, plaque growth that leads to dangerous cardiovascular events. And all got started with this modest effort, a dietary effort to turn off the expression of VLDL, small LDL, that resulted in the entire collection of strategies that some people call weak belly.